people think of New York, they think of New York City. New York, for the most part, is wildland.
So in 1976, in August, there was a major incident that took place in my hometown of Whitehall, New York. And it became famous because it involved several police agencies. 3 teenagers spot a creature walking near a telephone pole on Abair Road.
Well, Abair Road, that incident kind of solidified and verified a lot of the things that were going on around here for a number of years.
When people talk about these sightings, the sightings from the 70s, the sightings from the 80s, this was a negative for the witnesses.
So the New York baby footage, aka the Pridgin Film, that came to me. In fact, I was the first one ever to investigate that.
This is all sort of a similar type terrain, and so this could actually house a mystery for a very long time. When people think of New York State, they think of New York City, and they automatically think of large buildings and huge, urban area. But the reality is most of New York State is rural, and it's everything from woodlands to huge waterways. We're on the Great Lakes. We're bordering on the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. You have all these huge waterways from Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog and so forth. So actually New York State has a tremendous area that is rural in nature and has nothing to do with an urban setting. When you drive up the Northway, let's say from the city to upstate New York here, it's almost all rural areas, woodlands and so forth, and you can really see it from the highways. You get more of a respect for the type of wilderness we're dealing with.
So the wilderness areas in upstate New York, well, the Adirondack Park is 6 million acres. We have mountains, we have plains, we have forests, we have swamps, we have rivers, we have bogs, we have all sorts of wildlife. We have moose, we have plenty of deer, we have black bear. There's a lot of great fishing in New York. There's canoeing, kayaking, rock climbing if you want, mountain climbing, just a vast amount. People think of New York, they think of New York City. New York, for the most part, is wildland. And, the big reason behind that is, as we know, that the national park system was started by Theodore Roosevelt back in the early 1900s. Well, before Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States, he was governor of New York. So that's why we have such a big Adirondack Park.
When they promote the Adirondacks, they usually take 4 or 5 different parks, national parks, and they actually put them inside a map of the Adirondacks to show you just how large an area we're dealing with. In fact, years ago when there was the escape of prisoners from Dannemora, that they were able to stay hidden for weeks until they were finally captured or recaptured. That was because the terrain was so tough. We used all this technology of helicopters and tracking dogs and so forth, and yet it was their own mistakes that got them captured. So the wilderness is very dense in the Adirondacks.
So in this particular area, the foothills of the Adirondacks, the Whitehall area, we're primarily dairy country here. We do have some corn, and we have some maize, and we have some other smaller things, but we're big in dairy, and we're also big in those weird looking animals called the alpacas. Washington County, for whatever reason, which is where Whitehall is located at the very northern tip of Washington County, and throughout Washington County there are probably about 10 alpaca farms.
I would say that Whitehall would be considered the foothills of the Adirondacks, and if you go into the Vermont region, it would be the Green Mountains of Vermont, and if you go up into New Hampshire, you'd have the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So this is all sort of a similar type terrain, and so this could actually house a mystery for a very long time. I grew up in Whitehall, and when I grew up, we thought of Bigfoot and that type of phenomena as being the Pacific Northwest, Washington State and California and Oregon up into British Columbia and so forth. So in the 1976, we had a landmark case that occurred in my hometown, and that involved Bigfoot being seen by several police agencies. So that became a huge news item. So now, instead of thinking of Bigfoot as being in the Pacific Northwest, we're dealing with Bigfoot in our own backyard here. And so New York State, Vermont, we started researching into it, and we found out that there's a rich history in the Northeast of the Bigfoot phenomena. And if you were to do a search engine, you wouldn't search for Bigfoot, because that's a modern take on what this creature's name is. You would search for things like wild man, and then you will get voluptuous amounts of data from every state in the Northeast, from Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont and New York, and these are all states that would call the creature was called in the 1800s the wild man. So we have this rich history here, and then if you go back to the Algonquin and the Iroquois, for this area in the Abenaki and the Vermont region, you have tales of stone giants, giant men of the mountains, the Wendigos, and Samuel Champlain wrote about the Gugu. So this was the discoverer of Lake Champlain, and so he's a real fixture in this region. And he was able to write in his logs about the Gugu, which was what the Native Americans had described as this rather violent woods-type creature. A very large creature and not particularly nice. So these are all references to what we would refer to today as Bigfoot. So in 1976 in August, there was a major incident that took place in my hometown of Whitehall, New York. And it became famous because it involved several police agencies. So August of 1976, August the 24th, 3 teenagers spot a creature walking near a telephone pole on Abair Road. They're startled. They don't know what to make of it. So back then there were no cell phones, there's no communication like that. So they took off in their vehicle and rode into town to talk with the Whitehall police dispatcher on duty that evening. And they responded with Whitehall police, New York State troopers, and Washington County Deputy Sheriff all responding to the scene. So that became this landmark case because that incident was put on the front page of the paper, the local paper, which was the Post-Star. And it was an article called Officers Track Creature. And that described this Bigfoot type creature. And so that became this landmark case. So the local news, the affiliates from Albany came up and covered the story. And so this became a huge story for the Northeast. And basically, over a period of about a week, we had as many as a dozen witnesses that spotted this creature described as being 7 to 8 feet tall, walking like a man but looking like a gorilla, having dark fur or dark hair, and having red glowing eyes, long swinging arms, and making a sound like a pig squealing or a woman screaming. And it appeared to be afraid of light, or at least sensitive to light. So this creature phenomena that took place in '76 became very famous. However, if you look into the research, we had a report from 1975, a year earlier, May of 1975, at the Skeene Valley Country Club, located in Whitehall, New York. And that would involve Cliff Sparks, the owner. And it's about 11:30 at night, and he's going out to the golf course with his dog in the cart, and they're going off to green number 1. And that green's set near a little clump of woods. And as he gets to green 1, there's a creature standing on the middle of the green. Cliff is stunned. He looks over at his dog, who is usually very rambunctious. The dog is very subdued because the creature is staring at the dog.
I sat there, I kind of stunned for a minute, and this big thing, over 7 foot tall, built like a monster with terrific shoulders and long arms, was right in the middle of the green, and he stared at more at the dog than he did at me. And there's like these red lines coming out of his eyes, almost like laser beams. And the dog just hung its head over the cart and stayed there. And then the thing turned and crashed up to the woods.
So Cliff had this very unique close view of the creature's vision as it was staring at the dog, and the dog became subdued. And Cliff described the eyes in a very unusual description. He said they were almost like lasers. They were red, glowing, and it was almost like short dots coming out at the dog. Now that would be a characteristic I wouldn't include if I was hoaxing something. And so I think that's a real characteristic. Cliff Sparks got a unique view of this creature when it wasn't focused on him, but was focused on the dog. And so that became a case that Cliff didn't talk about for over a year until the Abair Road incident happened. Then he came public with it. But we got the report because we were friends of the family, so we know this is a very credible person. So there's a history of sightings like that in Whitehall. And so while Cliff's never got any publicity till later, the Abair Road thing got publicity immediately. But there was another case as well in the 1980s, just a few years after the Abair incident, in which Dan Gordon, who I went to school with, was a police officer in town, very credible, brutally honest person, and he's with another police official at the time. They would go out to the South Bay area, turn around, and then come back into town. And that was their usual patrol at about 4:30 in the morning. And so as they're going out to the South Bay area, this would be February of 1982, they encounter a road cross sighting, which is probably the most common type of sighting, in which a creature crosses the road in front of their cruiser. They pull the cruiser over, Dan does, he was driving. He puts it in park. The other officer stays in the car. He gets out of the car, draws his weapon, and then tries to pursue the creature, but the creature is long gone. Both gentlemen just took me to the site and described what they had seen. We were under strict protocols of keeping their anonymity. In fact, for years they were identified as anonymous law enforcement official because that had to protect them. They did not want to be known as the Bigfoot cops. And so Dan Gordon kept this secret for 23 years before he finally came forward. And he actually, we're walking up I lived near Dan, and we're walking up the road one day, and he says, I want to take a polygraph. Well, they arranged this polygraph through a documentary crew that was coming up, and it was a state polygrapher came up, and he gave a polygraph to Dan and said there was no deception. So for the skeptic, a report like Dan's wasn't in the paper, like Abair was. It was completely anonymous for years and years, and yet it was just as credible. And he passed the polygraph. He actually had a forensic sketch artist do a sketch of the creature he saw. And I'll never forget, she said, okay, as they worked for hours on this sketch, she said, I want you to put your face over the sketch, and I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine what that creature looked like, and then open your eyes and tell us how close we are. And I remember Dan said, he did that, and he said a 9.5, he says, because a 10 is up here. And he pointed at his head, at his brain. So it made an impact on Dan. It was a life-changing event. It wasn't something that was positive. That's one of the things that is often overlooked when people talk about these sightings. The sightings from the 70s, the sightings from the 80s, this was a negative for the witnesses. They didn't want to have this sighting. For Dan Gordon, it changed his entire belief system. And the only reason that he came forward eventually was he was in poor health, and he wanted to get this thing described, put it on the record, and he did.
Well, Abair Road, that incident kind of solidified and verified a lot of the things that were going on around here for a number of years. From the Cliff Sparks sighting at the Skeene Valley Country Club on hole 1 of the golf course, to the garbage being rifled through and by something large and bipedal on Novak Road, from the farmer shooting at an alleged Bigfoot on Carver's Falls Road. That whole area, that sighting just culminated into that one particular event there. It was the focus point. But the thing is that it's actually been going on since. It's been going on, in the 80s. We had Officer Dan Gordon have his sighting up here on Route 22. And to this day, people are recording sightings and seeing this tall, hairy bipedal creature known as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. My one research area, as the crow flies, is that way. I have another research area that's that way. That's my research area 2. And then I have a third one that's way out yonder. And 1 and 2 have been really active, more so 1. And I've had 2 sightings, one in 2011 and one in 2012. First one I saw was an adult about 8 foot tall. Second one I've seen was a juvenile about 5.5 feet tall. And that sucker must have heard me opening up my tent, and it was in mid-run when I peeked my head out there. And my first impression to that was like, nah, I couldn't have been. And then the next day, everybody was saying, well, something left this behind their truck, a log. And then another person found the track. So it was like, I guess I saw what I saw, and I wasn't like, and I think that's part of the psychological reasons too. People who have sightings, they try to talk themselves out of it a lot of times. No, I couldn't have seen that. No, it must have been a bear, or it must have been this, or it must have been that. But me, I just thought, oh no, it could have been. I must just be tired. And then they wake me up. Steve, something left a log behind my Jeep last night. The area that I had my encounter in 2006, that's where I got the Fort Ann cast. And then a year and a half later, Frank Sasienski gets a print from it looks appearingly the same individual, because it has the same callus on the foot, has the same kind of toe anomaly, but the toe splays are different, meaning it's like a biological thing. It's same heel width, same length, different toe splay. But that area is not not unknown for having these type of experiences. I was brought to that area way back in 2000 by a couple who had something screaming at them, basically escorting them out of the area. And the gentleman who was witnessing that kept seeing it out of the corner of his eye as he's leaving, and he could see this dark bipedal figure move from tree to tree to tree. Meanwhile, every once in a while, letting out a scream at him. So to me, that was very territorial. So I started hitting that area pretty hard. And then a couple of years later, another person had a sighting there that was sleeping in the parking area. Understand, I was very well versed and very well read in Jane Goodall and Chimps in the Mogombe and The Gorillas in the Mist by Diane Fossey. I was very familiar with those texts and how they interacted with primates. So every time I would get out of my car, I would, whoop a couple of times, maybe rap a knock, and I would say something. Hey, fellas, I'm here. And after a while, I think they just got used to, okay, he's not a threat. He's been here all these years. He's not bothering anything. And then one year, all of a sudden, things started happening. We kept hearing things like in 2010, the year before my sighting, we would leave a recorder going in our camp while we were out. And we would get some damn weird recordings in them. And we would constantly hear footsteps around too, as well, on these recordings. So and while we were there, we would hear footsteps all around us. It would be over there, be over there, be over there. And every time we would move out towards it, they would move back. And then 20 or so minutes later, they were back. So I think it was just a culmination of where they just were getting very comfortable with understanding that I was not a threat. And primates can very well recognize people's voices and different patterns of what they do. So just a little over a year ago, I tried doing that again, and I whooped a couple of times, and then I whistled a couple of times. I'm like, come on, fellas, you know who I am. Here I am. And then what happens is, maybe about a minute and a half later, we get this incredible, whooped vocal coming back at us.
Dude, did you just hear that?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's telling me at least one of them knows my voice out there still. Weird. I mean, can I explain it? No. Have I had experiences at that particular area every single time I go out there? No. It runs probably about a 20% of the time type of deal. Sightings even less. Sightings maybe like a 0.5%. But as far as noises and stuff, that runs about 20%. You'll get something or some sort of response or some sort of movement around you. And then the other time, it's just enjoying that beautiful country. The sighting that has always fascinated me the most was the first one that brought me up to my area. And this married couple, and mind you, the male had been doing work for the government. He had done work. In fact, some of his work's in the Smithsonian Institution. He's a graphic artist. He was a diver. He's worked on several really interesting underwater documentaries. And he'd lived up here all his life, had explored in that particular trail system all his life. He's encountered, since he was a young man, everything that there was to experience in that area, including a bear who basically grabbed his rucksack, right, from when he was camping, and he decided to basically, pickpocket the bear, because the bear was on the stump eating stuff, and he snuck up behind the bear and grabbed his rucksack back. And so it's an incredible story. But him and his wife were in the trail system, and they had gone off trail. And they had found this nice stream, and I said, maybe we'll have a little picnic here or whatever. And then as they were setting up for the picnic, something started screaming at them. And the way John had described it is that he could feel it in his chest, vibrating in his chest. He goes, this is like nothing he had ever heard before. So I said to my wife, we got to get out of here. And as they're leaving, like I said, he was seeing this thing moving, off in the distance a little bit, 50 yards maybe at most, just moving from tree to tree, while it was still screaming every once in a while at them. And that left such an indelible impression on me that something had happened there, something rather aggressive, something that which is kind of a rarity. You get them one time at time, but this was a rarity. And then it was followed up a few years later by a guy who was napping in one of the parking areas in that same area, and at the very foot of that same trail. And it was the middle of the night. He had to use a tree, and he woke up. He opened up the door of his car, and it hit something. And he looked down, and he saw a hairy foot. And he couldn't understand what he was looking at. And he looked up, and there is this one looking right down at him, looking at him in his face. And when he looked back up at it, it just looked at him, turned its eyes, and just walked off into the woods and gone. So those two sightings always remained like ingrained in me. And then years later, you would find just over the next ridge, there was a turkey hunter that was hunting one year, and as he's moving in the woods, all of a sudden, one stood up in the grasses and then just took off. And that was we found that guy completely by accident. We were shooting for Monster Quest, and we were shooting B-roll, and his wife came out and said, hey, what are you guys doing? And I got chatting with her. We're doing a show on Bigfoot. And she said, what? And I was like, yeah. She goes, let me get my husband. And she She said, you know, he's coming down. He had an experience back when he was turkey hunting. He came out and he told the whole thing. So to me, you know, every sighting in this area has a little bit of specialty, you know, specialness to it. Maybe because it's my home turf. Like when people ask me about the special cases, they're all of them from this area. Not so much from other areas, but this area is always like the special ones to me. I've taken reports from other parts of the state and from parts of Vermont as well. And each area definitely has their own unique flavor, maybe. Recently, I took a sighting in the Helderbergs, which is just north of the Catskills. It dealt with a wildlife rehabber and her son releasing some possums into the field. And the son said, okay, while you're releasing them, I'm gonna go down, take a walk down here and look for some morel mushrooms. And there he was, he stumbled upon a creature just across a small stream, and the creature walked off. Now I go in there that evening with my wife, and or not that evening I should say, but I go back to that area with the mother and son to show me the area. I come back that evening with my wife, and as we're walking in, I'm showing my wife where it happened, and all of a sudden, something maybe 75 yards in the dense forest, again, different flavor. You have some maple and oak over this way, and over here you have very dense pine trees and fir, and where the dense pine trees and fir, something went snap, crash, boom, thump, 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 off it went. Now what it was, I don't know. But it definitely was one of probably 3 types of creatures. It was either a very large black bear, a moose, which time to time do show up in the Helderbergs, or a Sasquatch. So whatever it was quite interesting, and it never happened again. And it actually stopped quite quickly, almost like it had stopped. Because usually with like a bear or something, they just keep moving and you can hear them traveling for a little while. Same thing with a moose. You'll hear them, you're still popping. But this thing went, you know, snap, crackle, pop, done. So who knows? I don't want to look into it more than it is. You know, I'd like to think it was a Sasquatch, but I can't say or can't prove it, and I can't say for sure, so I won't call it a Sasquatch. Because I'm very, very, very firm about those kind of details. Like, I'm not going to call it a Sasquatch if it wasn't one. So the New York baby footage, aka the Pridgin Film, that came to me. In fact, I was the first one ever to investigate that. It had come to me via the BFRO, and I had realized that this was a duplicate report. Apparently he had reported it, somebody had talked to him but stopped talking to him. So I called up the investigator that had talked to him, and I said, you know, have you talked to this guy? And he's like, I did. And he sounds kind of odd, but I said, well, did you ever see the film? And he's like, no, I never asked for it. Well, to me, how can you not ask for the film? You know, you can't, right? So I ended up talking to the guy, and the story seemed very believable. Gave me a lot of points that I could confirm, and I did. Every single thing he told me was true. You know, there was a film festival on this private park, Lembo Lake. It was owned by a guy named Mike Lembo. I spoke with Mike Lembo, who confirmed that we didn't allow pets or anything in there because we didn't have insurance for it. Everything was confirmed. And these guys, Doug and his friends, were shrunk off their ass, to put it bluntly. That's why a lot of times when I show the video, I have the video muted. But it happens to catch this is often in the background, this dark object, this dark, tall subject, move a couple of steps and something appears to pop off it, climb on hand over hand into the tree, swing a couple of times back, and then down. Now, the area that, now mind you, across the lake, there's a music festival going on. Does it appear to be a huge one? Yeah, maybe 1,000 people at most. And then you have this area, which was mainly the camping area, but it was pretty much empty. So behind this camping area, you have all these apple orchards. So you have food source. And eventually when I went there some 14 years later, because this came to me in 2003, but this was filmed in 1997. It wasn't discovered for 4 years. By the time I got down there, you could still see evidence of wild strawberries, wild blueberries, wild raspberries, and blackberries, and and the apple trees. So this was a bountiful harvest of area. You feed. Heck, I could go there and pick up fruit for enough fruit pies to last for a couple seasons. So tremendously a great area. Now, they didn't allow animals into the park. It's illegal to own a primate in New York without a zookeeper's license. And finally, if you owned a chimpanzee or a monkey at dusk, 8:30 in the evening, you were just going to let it up in a tree by itself, you would never get it down. And then somebody asked me one time, well, what makes you think Sasquatch young play in trees? Well, all primate young play in trees. Young gorillas climb trees. Why do you think we have monkey bars in parks? Because we as children love to climb trees and love to climb on things. Why? Because it's our discovery period of time. We're learning how dexterous our hands and feet are and what our bodies can do. And then as we get older, we get a little less limber. Lord knows that. And we get a little heavier. Lord also knows that one too. And what happens is branches can't support us, or we're just too achy and cranky to go up a tree.
Back in the early 80s, we'd been researching this phenomena pretty feverishly, and we met several researchers that were involved in this. One of them was Bruce Hallenbeck from Kinderhook, New York, and Bruce's family had actually had encounters with creatures down there. So Bruce is researching it, we're researching it. There was a researcher in Hudson Falls named Bill Brand who was doing the same. And so we all came together with my brother and we wrote Monsters of the North Woods. And that sort of focused on the Whitehall and the New York region and some parts of Vermont. And so Bruce Hallenbeck's research had shown of a creature down there called the Kinderhook creature. But there was a whole gambit of other creatures also described and documented by Bruce. So we're seeing that this phenomena that was so prevalent in the Pacific Northwest was now right in our own backyards. And so Monsters of the North Woods became a landmark book for this region. And then my brother and I followed that up with Bigfoot encounters in New York and New England with Hancock House. And that sort of explored not only the New York and Vermont areas, but it expanded into other places, be it Maine and Massachusetts and Connecticut and so forth. And you got to see these patterns of sightings that in the 1800s, all these places described wild men. And so that was what they were called, just like in China where the Che Rin or the wild man over there, we were calling it that over here in the 1800s. And it was almost uniformly done in the Northeast. So we get to see that the Pacific Northwest and the East Coast had the same phenomena going on. And when I went to college at Castleton State College, Dr. Cook he was one of the Pulitzer Prize nominee for Latin American history, so he was a heavyweight. And he was able to, being a professor of history and anthropology at Castleton, he was able to research this as well, much like what Grover Krantz had done at Washington University. And so he actually wrote the foreword for our book. And so now we had an academic who was investigating, and I went to Castleton to study communications at Castleton, and we were able to work with Dr. Cook extensively. So we're able to show that this region was plentiful with paranormal phenomena, and it was a region that had sort of been overlooked for years. And then we continued with a recent book is The Mysterious North Woods. And that's sort of a smorgasbord of paranormal phenomena, everything from poltergeists and UFO phenomena to Bigfoot, Sasquatch phenomena, and strange other reports as well. So we have this whole host of paranormal phenomena right in the Northeast here. Back in 1976, when the Abair Road incident happened and several law enforcement agencies were involved, there was often, it was reported in the Post-Star about the police officers sighting a creature. Well, the Rutland Herald ran an article about the UFO phenomena. There was a major UFO flap going on at the same time. Well, it turns out that there was a major flap of UFO sightings in the whole Northeast, and it went all the way down to Peekskill and so forth. So we had all these UFO sightings in conjunction with the Bigfoot outbreak, and that's often not reported. Within a week of the Abair Road sighting, back then we used to have a dispatcher on duty. Bob Martell was that dispatcher. And it was a great job. You sit in the, and you're at the police station, you handle a couple calls, and that's how it worked back then. Now it goes through county. So Bob Martell gets a call from a woman on 2nd Avenue. And she says, something just landed in my yard. And so Bob and Wilfred Goslin, who was a police sergeant at the time, they jumped in the car and went over. And she says, it's gone. She says, but something landed in my yard. And Bob said that he could reach down, and there was a 20-foot matted down area of grass that had been crushed down, and he could still feel the heat coming off where something had landed. Now, the interesting part of that is that if that object had landed just on the other side of the road, you would have never seen it. However, it landed in one of the most populated areas on the avenues. And this was within a week of the Abair Road sighting, and this was while there was this massive UFO flap going on. So it's hard to ignore that. In conjunction with that as well, we had Thunderbird reports, these large bird reports as well. So it was more, when they talk about the Bigfoot outbreak on Abair, it was more of a paranormal outbreak, which was often underreported. And many times with these cases, you have a Bigfoot sighting and you start to peel away the layers, and it's like an onion. And all of a sudden you might come across a UFO report, a big bird report, a poltergeist outbreak. All sorts of paranormal phenomena are often connected with these cryptozoological mysteries, and they're not as often reported. You have to go into the works of people like Brad Steiger and people like John Keel, who reported this type of phenomena back in the 60s and 70s, and it took me about 50 years to catch up to where they were. Another really interesting legend from the Northeast is that of the Lake Champlain monster, and it's often been called America's Loch Ness monster. And yet the sightings go back hundreds of years, so we have a rich history of champ reports. That's what the creature's been called. It used to be called champy, but most people refer to it as champ. And so this creature that will occasionally have a head and neck come out of the water, it's often described as being serpentine. There's all sorts of reports that were documented in the mid-70s by a teacher named Joe Zarzinski, who wrote a book called Champ Beyond the Legend. And Joe sort of reestablished the Lake Champlain monster research for this region. And there was a professor at Plattsburgh named Phil Raines as well, who did extensive work on this. In fact, in 1981, they held a seminar in Shelburne, Vermont, in which people from all over the world, Dr. Roy Mackel, William Eddy, and so forth, came and talked about Champ. It was the first international summit on the Lake Champlain monster. And Joe spoke there, and Phil Raines sort of moderated and spoke there as well. So that was a great gathering. Champ has become a very recognizable figure in the Northeast. In fact, if you go up to Port Henry, they have a law on the books, much like what Whitehall has, to protect Champ up there. So it's also a way for that community to embrace this phenomena. And they have champ conferences as well and champ seminars. So it's a way, it's sort of a modern phenomena now on this activity that years ago was so negative. It's a way for the communities to embrace this historical creature. And if I'm a skeptic and I'm saying, well, where's the body? There's nothing to it, whatever, it's fine. I appreciate that viewpoint. However, why are we seeing it? Let's explore it from a social, anthropological view as well. So for me, whether you're a skeptic or a believer, it's a win-win. One of the things that really impresses me are what I call confirmation moments. We had them with Cliff Sparks because we knew the family. We had them with the, some of the officers and stuff and so forth. However, these confirmation sightings, we had one in 2003 in which 2 Hong Kong nationals were up fishing in the Dresden, New York area. That's just halfway, going up to Ticonderoga way, going north. And they're out fishing, and they told us, they said, we saw this gorilla-type creature wading through the water at chest level. And I said to him, I said, what did you do? And he goes, well, we went fishing. And the beauty of that report is that in his own heritage, his own area that he grew up in, it wasn't unusual to see a primate. But he said, we just weren't expecting them here. Those are the types of sightings that you go, wow, because he didn't realize how important his sighting really was. And so those are what I call these confirmation sightings. They were so casual about it, so matter of fact. And I was like, wow. In fact, back then, Matt Moneymaker was interviewing one of the witnesses, and he actually picked out one of the drawings that we had in one of our books. So he was definitely sighting a Bigfoot type creature. Back in the early 2000s, Doug Hyzek came into town and he shot an episode called The Creature of Whitehall for his series Mysterious Encounters. And that was on back then it was the Outdoor Life Network. And then Doug also brought a crew in a couple years later, and they shot a special called Gigano, Search for the King Kong. And that was on the heels of Peter Jackson's King Kong remake. So that was the History Channel's documentary for that. And that included Whitehall. It included a recreation of the Dan Gordon encounter as a police officer. So more documentary crews followed. In fact, Doug came back with the Monster Quest series. So those are all History Channel shows. America's Book of Secrets has been here. Animal Planet's Finding Bigfoot came here and actually was able to film the famous telephone pole from Abair Road for the last time before it was taken down. So we've had crews like that. Small Town Monsters with Seth Breedlove and the Beast of Whitehall, the documentary that he did, and further documentaries as well. So it's become a noted area in cryptozoology, and I think James Fay, when he was here for Animal Planet, when he described it as the East Coast Willow Creek, really gave us a big boost, and always thank James for that. I grew up in Whitehall, so I've lived here all my life, and I was always interested in cryptozoology and ufology and all sorts of paranormal phenomena. Just didn't expect for a Bigfoot to be right in the Whitehall area. So back when these sightings took place in the 70s and really put Whitehall on the map for this, it was a negative experience for everybody involved. And the townspeople were kind of split. The police didn't want you talking about it. If you were a cop, you didn't talk about it because it would give you this negative stigma attached to you. You didn't want to be known as the Bigfoot cop. That's what Dan Gordon said. He said, so he kept his anonymity for 23 years. So this was largely a negative. So in about 2000 area, we had documentary crews coming in. And I thought this was a great time to put in the legislation to try to, recognize these creatures and put it in a different light. And when I went to college, I went to Castleton State College, where Dr. Warren Cook was a professor. And he tried to get these creatures put on the endangered species list when Madeline Kunin was governor. And he actually had an interesting attempt, but it didn't make it. So I thought this was a time we could actually pass legislation in honor of Dr. Cook. And it passed in both the town and the village to proclaim Whitehall as being a protective habitat for the Sasquatch. But it also drew recognition to the history involved, the stone giants, giant men of the mountains, the Wendigos, and so forth. So it was respectful of this hidden history that people had, sort of shunned and been afraid to talk about. And now it was in the limelight. And so with every documentary crew, more attention came out, and it became more of a positive. So in 2015, 2016, they set up a festival in Whitehall. It was Dave Molinar was reading about a mosquito calling contest. And he said, they're having a mosquito calling contest in this small town. Why can't we have a Bigfoot calling contest? It was a great idea. So we started this festival, and I've been able to speak at each festival since it began. And when we first started, there were only maybe a couple hundred people. And then it just grew and grew and grew. And unfortunately, David's passed on, but Barbara Spohr took the contest over, coordinating the contest, and she brought it to a whole different level. So we're now dealing with thousands of people, her hard work and volunteers around town. And so now we've been able to embrace the phenomena. It's become a form of ecotourism, but at the same time, people like Dan Gordon now don't have to remain hidden and silent and bottled up for 23 years. They can come forward with their encounter.
Well, when I first got really into the Whitehall proper area, it was probably about 20 years ago. And it wasn't as commonly as accepted as it is today. It wasn't something you'd feel comfortable walking around town talking about necessarily. You would talk around it in smaller circles, but eventually it started to change, because once people started to know you, people would open up a little bit more. And then through people like Dan Gordon and Paul Bartholomew, and even Bill Brandt to an extent, and Brian Goslin especially, it built something. Paul was huge in getting the ordinance filed here to protect the Sasquatch. And then eventually it seemed like the town embraced it, and they looked at it for tourism. Now you come to this Whitehall Festival, and there's at least a couple of thousand people here every year now, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. I MC the calling contest, and every seat in that amphitheater is filled up. And then there's people, literally 60 or 70 people on each side standing around watching. So it's just a tremendous event. It's in good spirits, and it's a chance for people to get educated, and you don't see too many naysayers there anymore. So that's kind of a cool thing.
So I think that's the main difference. In the 70s, this was a negative, and now it has turned into a positive. And with this festival that Barbara Spohr has brought to new heights, we now have thousands of people embracing the phenomena. So you're more inclined to talk about it if you encounter it, where in the 70s it was something you didn't discuss. A lot of people who are in positions of respectable jobs and so forth that deal with forestry and law enforcement may not want to come forward with their tale, but because of the attention and the positive attention that's been drawn to this by the festival and by the research we've done and so forth, they will confide with me because they know we'll keep their anonymity. And so if they want to relate a story, I will deal with it exactly how they want to, whether they want to be anonymous, whether they want the story told or not told. We work on their terms. So we're able to amass hundreds of sightings in this region that we probably wouldn't be if we didn't have a festival and recognition of this phenomenon.